In the silver shadows of the urban jungle, the truth is often a matter of perspective and the angle of light. We follow the paths of those who walk between worlds to find the stories the light is too bright to see. Click subscribe now and find what is hidden.
Early numbers were due by 9. My screen showed a spinning wheel where the dashboard should have been. I refreshed, still spinning. I called the server room. No answer. I sent a Slack message to my manager. He read it. I saw the check mark and said nothing. That was the Monday after they locked me out. Let me back up. I spent 4 years building the financial reporting system at Caldwell & Associates, not tweaking it, not maintaining someone else's work, building it from the ground up, query by query, automation by automation, until the thing ran like a Swiss watch. Every Monday morning at 7:45, 53 customized reports landed in the inboxes of every VP, every regional director, every partner in the firm. Nobody asked how. Nobody asked who. They just opened their emails, saw the numbers, and made their decisions. I was the who. My name is Amy. I was 38 years old, a senior data analyst with a mortgage, a 12-year-old who needed braces, and a track record that should have made me untouchable. Should have. The firm was mid-sized. About 400 employees across 3 regional offices. The kind of place where everybody knew everybody, where the holiday party still had an open bar, and where promotions came slowly but felt earned when they arrived. I liked it there. I genuinely did. I liked the work, liked most of my colleagues, liked that when something went wrong at 2 in the morning, I was the one they called because I was the one who could fix it. That last part is important. My direct manager, I'll call him my manager because that's what he was and that's all he deserves, had joined the firm about 18 months before everything fell apart. He came in loud, confident, with an MBA from somewhere that impressed the partners and a talent for presenting other people's work as his own. I noticed it early. I watched him stand in front of the executive team and walk through analyses I had built, using language I had written in the internal documentation without once mentioning my name. I said something to him about it after the 3rd time. He smiled. He said, "Amy, that's just how presentations work. Nobody wants to hear about the engine. They want to see the car drive." I let it go. I shouldn't have, but I did. What I didn't let go was the documentation. Every system I built, every automation I wrote, I documented it internally. Not just what it did, but how it did it, what credentials it ran under, what would break if someone touched the wrong thing. I'd been doing it for years, partly out of professional habit and partly because I'd watched enough colleagues leave suddenly to know that an undocumented system is a ticking clock. My system ran under my credentials. This was not a secret. It was, in fact, a known issue that I had flagged in writing no fewer than 3 times over 2 years. The system needed a service account, a dedicated, non-personal set of credentials that wouldn't be tied to any single employee. I wrote it in project reviews. I put it in my annual development plan. I brought it up in a one-on-one with the IT director. Every time, the answer was the same: budget constraints. Competing priorities, we'll get to it. They didn't get to it. The last 6 months at Caldwell were the hardest. My manager had developed a habit that went beyond credit stealing. He started scheduling what he called deep dive weekends, mandatory Saturday sessions to prep for quarterly reviews, unpaid, off the books. Just the expectation that you would show up and work because that's what dedicated team members did. The first time I showed up, 10 hours on a Saturday, building models I'd already told him could be automated if someone would approve the infrastructure request. I went home exhausted and found an email in my inbox where he had forwarded the finished work to the CFO with the subject line, "Weekend work, great output from the team." Not my name, the team. The second time, I showed up again because I told myself that pushing back would look like I wasn't a team player. When the third one came around, I said no, not dramatically. I sent a polite, professional email on Thursday afternoon explaining that I had a prior family commitment that weekend and would not be available for Saturday's session. I offered to complete any time-sensitive tasks by Friday Cobb. He didn't respond that day. Monday morning, I arrived at the office at 8:15. My badge didn't work at the front door. I stood there for a moment, holding it against the reader, watching the light blink red. A colleague held the door for me, and I walked in, thinking it was a system glitch. Those happened occasionally. I sat down at my desk. My laptop asked for my network credentials. I typed them in. Access denied. I tried again. Access denied. I checked my personal phone for emails. There was one, sent at 6:47 that morning, from HR. It said my employment with Caldwell & Associates had been terminated effective immediately, that a separation agreement would be mailed to my home address, and that I should leave any company property at the front desk before departing the building. 6:47 in the morning. They had done it before I even woke up. I sat at that desk for about 60 seconds reading the email twice. Then I picked up my personal items, a coffee mug, a photo of my daughter, a cardigan I kept on the back of my chair, and I walked out. I did not stop at the front desk. I drove home. I made another cup of coffee. I sat at my kitchen table and thought about everything. And then I remembered something. 3 months earlier, I had put in a formal, written request to have the automated reporting system migrated to a service account. I had included a risk assessment. I had quantified what would happen if my personal credentials were ever disabled, scheduled jobs would fail, the Monday reports would not generate, and any data refresh tied to my access would simply stop. I had attached my previous requests. I had CCIT, my manager, and the director of operations. My manager had replied to that email with 4 words, "Not a priority right now." I had saved that email. I had saved all of them. Here's what the people who sent my termination at 6:47 in the morning did not think about. Disabling my credentials did exactly what my risk assessment said it would do. At 7:45 that Monday, 53 automated reports did not land in 53 inboxes. At 8 o'clock, the VP of Finance started making phone calls. At 8:15, when I was still standing at the front door trying to badge in, the Monday morning executive briefing was already running 20 minutes late because nobody could explain why the dashboard was showing a spinning wheel where the revenue numbers should have been. By 9, IT had been looped in. By 9:30, they had identified the problem. Every scheduled job in the reporting system was running under my credentials. Disabled credentials. The jobs were failing silently, logging errors that nobody had been monitoring because, and I want to be very precise here, nobody had been monitoring them because I was the one who monitored them, and I was no longer employed by Caldwell and Associates. By 10, my manager was in the IT director's office. I know this because a former colleague texted me, "What is happening? Everything is down. Your manager looks like he's going to pass out." I texted back, "Sorry to hear that. Hope they get it sorted." I meant it genuinely about my colleagues. About him, I meant nothing. The partner's call with a major institutional client was scheduled for 11 that morning. That client paid a retainer that represented roughly 8% of the firm's annual revenue. The call required a live portfolio performance report that was generated automatically, beautifully, every Monday morning at 7:45 by the system I had built. The system that was now returning errors. My manager called my personal cell phone at 10:20. I let it go to voicemail. He called again at 10:35. I let that one go too. At 10:50, the IT director called. I answered because the IT director was not the person who had stolen my work, not the person who had scheduled unpaid Saturdays, not the person who had scheduled unpaid Saturdays, not the person who had terminated me by email before sunrise. She said, "Amy, I'm going to be straight with you. The reporting system is down. We can't get it running without your credentials or without someone who understands the architecture. I know you were let go this morning, and I want to say personally that I think it was handled very badly. Is there any chance you'd be willing to walk us through what we're dealing with?" I said, "I documented everything. The documentation is in the internal SharePoint under Data Systems in a folder called Reporting Architecture. There's a subfolder called Service Account Migration. I submitted that request 3 months ago." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "I see it." I said, "The risk assessment is in there. It describes exactly what's happening right now." Another pause. She said, "Amy, I need to ask, is there anything in the system that would prevent us from simply reconfiguring the jobs under a new account?" I said, "No, the documentation covers that too. It'll take a few hours if your team follows the steps, but it's all there." That was true. I documented it completely because that is who I am. I did not booby-trap anything. I did not plant time bombs. I simply built a system that required specific credentials to run and flagged the risk in writing repeatedly and was ignored. And then the people who ignored me disabled those credentials without any plan. The consequence was their own making. The client call was rescheduled. The IT team spent most of Monday working through the migration. The 53 reports went out at 4:17 that afternoon instead of 7:45 in the morning. I spent that Monday updating my resume. The separation agreement arrived by mail on Wednesday. I read it carefully. It included a non-disparagement clause, a non-compete for 18 months within a 50-mile radius, and a severance offer of 4 weeks' pay. 4 weeks. For 4 years of building systems that, as of that Monday, had brought the entire firm's reporting infrastructure to its knees for 6 hours. I did not sign it. I hired an employment attorney instead. I found her through a referral from a friend, and she was exactly the kind of person you want in your corner. Calm, precise, and deeply unimpressed by corporate HR language. I brought her the emails, every documented request for the service account migration, every weekly report I'd sent to my manager with status updates he'd forwarded upward with his name on them, the 3 prior warnings about credential dependency, the risk assessment. She read through everything and said, "They terminated you for refusing unpaid work on a weekend?" I said, "That's my red." She said, "And the system they fired you over was running under your personal credentials, which you flagged as a risk in writing 3 times. 3 times. I confirmed. She said, "Okay, let's talk about what we're going to ask for." The demand letter went out 2 weeks after my termination. I won't walk through every detail because some of it is still under a confidentiality agreement, but I will say this: the conversation shifted significantly once the documentation hit the table. The non-compete evaporated in the first negotiation call. The severance offer moved in a direction that made my attorney nod slowly and say, "That's acceptable." While all of this was happening, I had been quietly talking to a few contacts in the industry. One of them was the head of analytics at a wealth management firm across town, a place I'd done a brief consulting project for 2 years earlier. She had reached out the previous fall to ask if I was ever interested in making a move. I'd said not at the moment, but I kept her number. I called her the Tuesday after my termination. We had lunch on Thursday. By the following Monday, exactly 2 weeks after I'd stood at the front door of Caldwell watching my badge blink red, I had a written offer on my kitchen table. Senior Manager of Data Infrastructure, a 22% salary increase, a real budget, a team of 3 analysts reporting to me, and a company that used service accounts. I accepted the offer that afternoon. There's a version of the story where I'm bitter about what happened, and honestly, I'd be lying if I said there were no bitter moments. Standing in the parking lot at 8:15 that Monday, holding my coffee mug in my cardigan, I felt things I'm not proud of: humiliation, rage, a very specific kind of grief that comes from realizing that a place you cared about didn't care about you back. But here's what I've thought about a lot in the months since. They didn't fire me because I was bad at my job. They fired me because I declined a 3rd unpaid weekend. That's the whole story. 4 years of building something that the entire firm depended on, and the moment I said, "I have a prior commitment this Saturday," the decision was made. Not by someone who understood what I'd built, not by anyone who had read the risk assessments, by someone who thought of me as interchangeable, as a resource to be managed, as a piece of the machine rather than the person who built it. What they didn't understand, what people like my manager never understand, is that the machine knows who built it, not metaphorically, literally. The credentials that ran every automated job in that system belonged to me. The documentation that allowed IT to fix it in a single day existed because I wrote it. The risk assessment that described exactly what would happen when those credentials were disabled existed because I cared enough about the firm to put the warning in writing 3 times in the hope that someone would listen. They didn't listen. And then it happened exactly the way I said it would. I don't take pleasure in the 6 hours of chaos that Monday. I take something quieter than that, a kind of satisfaction that comes from knowing I did the job right, documented it honestly, warned them clearly, and when they made their choice, I made mine. My manager, I heard through the grapevine, is no longer with the firm. The circumstances were described to me as a restructuring. I don't know the details, and I didn't ask. I hope the people who stayed, the ones who used to bring me coffee when I was debugging at midnight, the ones who sent me "what is happening" texts that Monday morning, I hope they landed somewhere that treats them better than that place treated me. I sent a few of them my new work email before I started the new role, just so they'd have it, just in case. My daughter got her braces, by the way. She came home from the consultation and said, "Mom, the orthodontist says I have a complicated case." I said, "Baby, you come from a long line of women who handle complicated cases just fine." She rolled her eyes at me. It was perfect. I started the new job on a Monday. First thing I did, before I unpacked my bag, before I logged into a single system, was schedule a kickoff meeting with my new team to review the infrastructure. First item on the agenda, service account audit. Every automated job, every scheduled report, every data pipeline. I wanted to know exactly what credentials each one ran under and whether any single person's departure could bring the whole thing down. It took us 2 weeks to clean it up completely. My team did good work. At the end of the second week, my manager, my actual manager, the one who had hired me, stopped by my desk and said, "The IT director told me what you've been working on." She said it's the most thorough infrastructure review she's seen in years. I said, I've learned that documentation is the best revenge. He laughed. He thought I was joking. I wasn't entirely joking. There's one more thing I want to say, and I'll say it plainly. Some people, when they hear this story, ask whether I think what happened to the firm that Monday was fair to the other employees. I understand the question. The 53 people who didn't get their reports until 4 in the afternoon didn't make the decision to fire me. The analysts who scrambled to cover the client call hadn't stolen my work or scheduled the unpaid Saturdays, and they're right to ask. The honest answer is, I didn't cause that chaos. I had warned repeatedly that disabling a single person's credentials would cause exactly that outcome. The people who decided to disable those credentials without a transition plan, without even a phone call, without a morning's notice, they caused it. I documented the risk. They accepted the risk by ignoring it. When the risk materialized, it materialized because of their choices, not mine. I left that job with nothing in the system but what I'd built in good faith. No traps, no planted errors, no ticking clocks. Just an automated system running under credentials they chose to disable at 6:47 in the morning without so much as a conversation. The documentation was there. The warnings were there. The fix was there. All they had to do was read what I wrote. I thought a lot about what actually happened in this story. Not the drama of it, not the 6 hours of chaos, but the underlying logic of how it all unfolded. Nobody set a trap. Nobody planned a revenge. What happened was simpler and, honestly, more instructive than any deliberate scheme could have been. My manager made a series of choices. He chose to take credit for work that wasn't his. He chose to demand unpaid weekends and treat that demand as non-negotiable. He chose to terminate me by email before sunrise rather than have a conversation. And at every step, those choices were made possible by one assumption, that I was interchangeable, that the work lived in the system, not in the person who understood it. That assumption was wrong, and the consequences of it were entirely his own. I think about the word integrity a lot differently now than I did in my 20s. When I was younger, I understood integrity as a moral quality. You were honest, you kept your word, you didn't cheat. All of that is true. But what I've come to understand is that integrity is also structural. When you build something with care, when you document it honestly, when you warn people about risks even when they don't want to hear it, you are creating a record of who you are. That record doesn't disappear when you do. It stays in the system. It shows up in the emails. It speaks for you when you're no longer in the room. The risk assessments I filed weren't acts of self-protection. I filed them because I genuinely believed the firm needed to know. I filed them because that's what responsible professionals do. And when everything fell apart on that Monday morning, those documents didn't just help IT fix the problem. They told a complete story about whose judgment had been sound and whose hadn't. Resilience is a word that gets overused, I think. People talk about it like it means refusing to break, like strength is measured by how little you show. But the kind of resilience I needed that morning, standing in a parking lot holding a coffee mug and a cardigan, reading a termination email on my phone, that wasn't about being tough. It was about knowing what I had built and trusting that it would still be true whether or not my badge worked. I called my attorney because I had documentation. I called my contact across town because I had a reputation I had earned over years. I walked into a new job 2 weeks later because the work I had done at Caldwell spoke for itself, even after Caldwell stopped speaking for me. The intelligence piece, and I say this not as a boast but as a practical observation, was the documentation, knowing your own systems deeply enough to anticipate failure modes, writing it down, keeping copies. Understanding that the most valuable thing you can do in any professional role is make yourself legible, to your team, to your organization, to yourself. Because the moment you leave or are asked to leave, that legibility is the only thing that travels with you. What my manager never understood is that you cannot separate the machine from the mind that built it. Not cleanly. Not overnight. Not by sending an email at 6:47 in the morning and expecting the world to keep running the same way. I don't wish him ill. I genuinely don't. But I do hope he learned something from that Monday. I hope someone, somewhere in his career, sits him down and explains that the people who do the work are not overhead. They are the infrastructure. My daughter will enter the workforce someday. When she does, I'm going to tell her one thing above everything else. Document your work like someone is going to have to rebuild it without you, because someday they will. And what you leave behind will say everything about the kind of person you were while you were there.